Great. Thank you, Cynthia. Thank you to the Foreign Press Center and all of you for coming. Let me say a few things. I think it'd be hard for me to talk about, jump right into Congress without saying a little something about the election, given that that is what's going on today, and that will shape what happens in Congress. And I think especially if we spend a little time talking about the political parties and how they've become more and more polarized over the years, and how that will affect how governing goes on after this election, as it has been for the last several years. I'll give you a quick history of the political parties in America. The simplest point, I think, is that for many years, for much of the 20th century, two political parties, the Democratic Party was the majority party for many years, but both parties had significant variation within their parties. The Democratic Party was, yes, the party on the left, but it had a strong conservative wing in the South. Republican Party was the party on the right with some Northeast, more left or liberal members. So the parties overlapped. The parties were not all left and right. There was a lot of movement in the middle, and that meant when one worked to get some legislation done in Congress, that meant that you needed some people from the other party. You didn't expect to get a majority with just your own party. The simplest story is over the years we've become more and more separated with fewer and fewer conservative Democrats and liberal Republicans. And today the most conservative Democrat is to the left of the most liberal Republican. And so I think that will continue. I think one thing to watch for in this election and coming up after the election is there probably are even a few more members in the middle who are going to lose, whatever the results are. Some of them, especially in the Senate, some of the senators who are in very deeply Republican states held by Democrats are likely to lose. And I think that middle, which is already kind of small in Congress, will shrink even further. Let me say a couple things about midterm elections broadly, why it's going to go the way it might. One, midterm elections tend to go against the party in power, in the party in the White House. We political scientists had almost an absolute rule for many years that no president's party could win seats. 1934, Franklin Roosevelt did it, and Democrats won in that year. We did have a couple of small examples in 1998 with Bill Clinton and George Bush in 2002. But really, those were only a handful of seats, and that was when those presidents were at very, very high levels of popularity. We don't expect the president's party to win seats. We expect them to lose some. Second, the turnout mix, the people who show up in midterm elections, there are fewer of them than a presidential election, and the mix tends to be more Republican, more older voters, more regular voters, fewer minorities, fewer younger voters. So I think there's another factor that points in the Republican direction. And then third, the president's job approval rating. If you follow where he's been all year, it's actually been pretty consistent, but it's been on the low side, certainly lower than where he was when he won re-election in 2012. 40, 42%, depending on which poll you look at. That's not a good number, not as low as the worst days of the George Bush presidency when he was down at 30% or lower, but certainly not in the range where you'd say, that's a good number where you get reelected. As much as the president does not want the election to be about him, although he did say once that it was about his policies, midterm elections tend to be about the president. They tend to be reacting to the president in power, even though he doesn't appear on the ballot. So as I say, I think all those things point to, pretty likely Republican gains. They're factors that are helpful to them. What quickly might happen, and I think that can give us the landscape for what Congress is going to look like. I think Republicans are likely to take the Senate. The Senate requires 6 seats for Republicans to pick them up. It is, I think, theoretically possible for Democrats to hold the Senate, but everything would have to break right for them. Getting those 6 seats is a likelihood for Republicans. I think you're likely to see, especially, I mentioned, 6 very strongly Republican seats. Places like West Virginia and Montana and South Dakota. And then you also have incumbents sitting in Republican states like Louisiana and Arkansas and Alaska. Those are very strongly Republican places. They're likely to go in the Republican direction. I'll save for the questions if you have questions about particular other races, but I'd say Republicans have some other chances. There's some other funny races like Kansas or maybe Georgia who could go in the other direction, but I think on the whole, we expect Republicans to do quite well, probably to take the Senate. In the House, we expect a number of seats to go in the Republican direction, probably not a large number. They already have a sizable majority, so somewhat less than 10. What that means is a more Republican Congress. Likely the Senate, more Republican Senate, a more Republican House. And I guess the question really on the table here is, what will that mean? How will things be different if Republicans do take the Senate and do take some more seats in the House? Well, on one hand, I don't think things are going to be dramatically different. We already have divided government. We have, since the 2010 elections, we've had a president of one party and at least part of Congress of the other party. And as I described before, the parties used to be much more overlapping. As the parties are further apart in their voting patterns, that means the differences are greater on policy. And that means it's hard in divided government, hard to find things to work on together. Not impossible, and we, my institution, we try to find ways in which we think that some of those compromises can come about, but I don't want to tell you that everybody agrees on everything. There certainly is a lot of disagreement on big policy areas, and the loss of moderate members and the further apart the parties are makes it very difficult. So what might be different? Well, one thing for the Republicans will have some extra power if they have the Senate. And one thing that might mean is very difficult for the president to get nominations through the Senate. That's for judges or for appointees to his administration. Certainly, I think you'll see some sort of push in the lame duck in the last few weeks or before the end of the year on some of the existing nominations. We've got an attorney general who's leaving. We've got some other important nominations up there. That will be an important push. But once Republicans are in charge in the majority, if that happens in this election, they'll be more skeptical and push back on the president. And I think especially given their concern that Harry Reid and Democrats have changed the rules in a direction that the Republicans didn't agree on nominations, and I think they're going to be more likely to hold up or slow down nominations of the president. Certainly, we'll see more investigations. I mean, the power in Congress is the power to hold hearings. The House already has that power, but with the Senate in Republican hands, we'll see that ability enhanced. I think Republicans also will have a goal to put a number of pieces of legislation on the president's desk. That doesn't mean we're necessarily going to get a lot of things done, but it does mean that the Republicans would like to say, look, we as the House of Representatives have passed a number of bills. Some of them, you could say, would be more political, more divisive, and some of them are smaller, more practical bills. But the Senate hasn't passed them. So the Republicans, I think, will look to put their version of a number of policies on the president's desk. Will they be able to do that absolutely successfully? It's often hard to get your senators together. As you know, some bills require 60 votes in the Senate, could be filibustered by Democrats. So Republicans will not have always an easy task about getting what they want to put on the president's desk to see if he'll veto it. I will add one other factor. I can count at least 3 Republican senators who are likely to run for president. That's Ted Cruz and Rand Paul and Marco Rubio. Perhaps there'll be more. And they will not necessarily be the best team players in the Senate all the time. They may find that they want to distinguish themselves and not be part of the team that passes things and puts it on the president's desk. So Mitch McConnell doesn't have an easy job generally, but might have an even more difficult job partly because of that factor. So finally, I guess I don't want to leave you with notes of complete pessimism that nothing could ever get done in the U.S. Senate if this election result comes to pass as we think it will. What are the possibilities for the parties working together? And this has always been a problem for second-term presidents. If you look back, I wrote a book about Bush's second term, and the second-term presidents really follow a very similar pattern. They have often lost Congress. Almost every president, going back to, every full second-term president going back to FDR, did not have control of the Congress during the second term. They often are a little bit lower in popularity. They've done, or at least tried to do, many of their large signature achievements earlier in their term, and they're more experienced in foreign policy. So the typical trend for a president is to say, look, I know I'm not going to get that much done in Congress, so I'm going to spend a little more time on foreign policy. I think you also will see as some presidents have done, but maybe this president is emphasizing even more some actions that the president will try to take on his own. He's clearly said he will try to use executive action on immigration matters, on some climate matters. So I think you'll see some of that go on without Congress, and Congress probably won't like that. There'll be some fighting back and forth. But all of that being said, there's still, even in these presidents who've had a hard time getting things done with a party, Congress of the other party, they have occasionally found one or two things to work on, legacy items. I look back to Ronald Reagan, who, with Democrats in 1986, passed major tax reform. I look back to Bill Clinton and Newt Gingrich, who passed welfare reform and other matters. So there are definitely times when a president can say, look, maybe I'm not working off of my agenda. It's not what I ran on originally to get in, but there's something that we can compromise on. And so those issues are hard to find. I think there are a lot of issues that the parties are very different on. But here are a couple. I mean, one is trade, and I think that theme has been picked up. I've been saying this for a little while, but I think some of the press has picked this up, that trade is some ways more favorable with a Republican Congress than with Democrats in charge of the Senate. Why is that? Most presidents who we've had, really essentially all presidents, have been broadly pro-free trade. That's Democratic presidents and Republican presidents. Maybe some small differences between them, but really Democratic presidents have been free traders. The Democratic caucus in Congress is not as free trade. There is certainly a significant fraction of Democratic members of Congress who are more protectionist, more worried about free trade. With Republicans in charge of the Senate and the House of Representatives, the president might find that they can work better with the Republican Congress, and that might mean trade promotion authority, or he's not got the deals ready, but if there were deals ready in Europe or Asia and some of the places you're covering, and they were to come to the Senate, they're going to get a more favorable hearing. You're going to have Republicans who would be more willing to give the president authority to look favorably, to even want to find some accomplishment. So I think that's one area where we might see some movement. Two is tax reform. I mean, tax reform is almost always something that you could find a deal on. It's hard to know how large a deal. Certainly both parties have talked about major corporate tax reform. They've gotten a little bit confrontational in how to do it leading up to this election. But I think with more time, with the election past us, there's the sense that there are people in both parties who think that our tax code broadly, or certainly our corporate tax, is not what it should be, and that there might be some at least minor fixes in that realm. And the other thing I think that Republicans have said is that they may be there to help the president if he is looking for more robust support for his battle against ISIS, or perhaps some other foreign policy matters. When we had the votes on authorization of force in Syria and Iraq on ISIS, there were certainly Republicans and Democrats who came to his defense. And I think you have some people on the Democratic side who are a little weary of the president moving more strongly back into the Middle East after he said he would take troops out, and he had moved troops out. And Republicans, not all of them are with the president. Some of them think he's not being robust enough. Some of them probably don't want to vote for him, but certainly a substantial fraction said they would help. And so it may be that on some foreign policy matters like this, where the president is going to need some support from Congress, he actually is going to find it in members of the Republican Party. So I think the landscape really broadly is Republican direction of the election, likely Republican Senate. That means not a fundamental change, not everybody agreeing to everything or one party getting their way, but there are a few opportunities where Republicans and Democrats might work together. Lastly, I think all of us are looking a little bit ahead at the 2016 election. I typically get a call right after the presidential election asking me about 4 years later, 8 years later. I've heard all sorts of reports from reporters, who's going to win. Without getting into all the details, I think the simplest thing to say is, this election has certain conditions to it. President not doing so well, midterm election. The next election, we don't know what those conditions are. So I don't think Republicans should feel by winning in 2014 that they are necessarily going to win in 2016. Nor do I accept many Democrats thinking presidential years are just so good for Democrats, Republicans can never win. I think we'll have an open race, and we can talk more about it. But what we do in Congress in the next couple of years there'll be something, not major and substantial, but many people will be looking to 2016, where essentially it is an open race. And I think the questions are always better than my talk, so I'm going to stop right there and turn to you.
Great. Just reminders again. Please state your name and outlet when you have a question. When I give you the floor as well, please wait for the microphone because we are transcribing. And colleagues in New York, if you have a question, please approach the podium and we'll call you in due order. And we have a question right up here, second row, and then. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Laura Saarikoski from the Finnish newspaper Helsingin Sanomat. Why have the Republicans and Democrats come apart in all the values during the past couple of years? Why has the divide widened instead of, getting narrower?
Well, thank you. I was actually in Helsinki this summer after having been there twice before in the middle of winter, so I enjoyed my trip this summer even more. Look, I think one of the reasons I tried to give this little bit of historical perspective on the parties was to show that it used to be easier to find common ground because, let's say, the Democratic Party had a more progressive part, but they didn't really have a majority. They needed some of the progressive Republicans to work together. They kind of agreed with some Republicans, and some of their conservative Democrats agreed with Republicans, and so we'd have this conservative coalition. That was a different world that we have today. Really, the most endangered people in Congress are the people like Mary Landrieu or people who occupied the open seats in Montana and West Virginia who are leaving. Those were people that are very. It used to be they could go home and say, "Look, I'm a Democrat. I know you in my state voted for Republicans, but I'm like you. I know what it's like to be a West Virginia Democrat, not a national Democrat." It's become very hard to say that today. You have really a nationalization of politics. I'll give you an example of my county in Virginia. We have a race for the county board, and the county board is dealing with very local issues. But the ads and the pieces of paper that are coming in are asking about their positions on foreign policy and on social issues, which they are never really going to make a difference on. They're going to build roads or schools or a trolley is a big issue in our county. And so the parties don't have as many, Democrats don't have as many conservatives in their party. Republicans don't have as many liberals.
Why is that? Why has it happened?
Well,
it wasn't like this 15 years ago.
Well, it was moving in this direction 15 years ago. I think it's because the regions have realigned. Before, again, you had some conservative Democrats who could win in the South by saying, "Look, I'm like you locally. I can be a North Carolina Democrat." But that's not the same thing as really liking Michael Dukakis, who we view as or John Kerry, who we think is a Northeastern liberal. We're not liberals. We're conservative Democrats. And I think many people think, political scientists back in the 40s and 50s said this is a horrible system where the parties don't really stand for anything, that you really should have more clear distinction between the parties. I think we've gotten that, and that's partly because it's just very hard to define yourself differently, locally than nationally. And I think there's sometimes people will say there are things that pushed it forward, things like media or just being able to know broadly about, to have more political media, but also to know more about what's going on in the whole country and not just your party. But I think the biggest point is that we've now got two ideological parties, and before we didn't, and it's been a slow transition, but it's almost fully done, where the parties are pretty left and right.
Question up here in the front.
Thank you. My name is Andrei Sitov. I'm with TASS, the Russian news agency, and thank you to the FPC for hosting this, and thank you, sir, for doing this. My question is about foreign policy, and specifically Russia. Is Russia one of the subjects that you feel that the Democrats and the Republicans can agree on and beating up on it? Specifically, there is a bill on sanctions, potentially long-lasting bill, Menendez-Corker, I think it is, that may come up even in the lame duck session. What, in your opinion, what is the potential for the overall subject to become a hobby horse for this upcoming Congress, and on this particular bill to be passed. Thank you.
Great, thank you. And on my same trip, I did spend a couple days in your country as well, and also in the summer, which I enjoyed. So I'm hoping I can go around the room to everybody, but I think I'm gonna lose my streak after that. I first broadly thinking about foreign policy. The election is not turning on foreign policy directly, but I will say things have changed a bit. The president had really much better ratings on foreign policy in the first term. Things were going well. There are a lot of reasons I think we can point to. And he had, while not full support from Republicans, he certainly had support from Republicans on some issues, and he also, I think, had support from his original base running in the Democratic Party as someone who was more strongly against the wars than Hillary Clinton or John Edwards. So when you looked at the president's numbers, he was 5 or 6 points higher in job approval rating for foreign policy. That has switched, really. His foreign policy numbers are down. I think the election is not going to be run on Russian policy, although there are certainly a number of Republicans running ads on the treatment of ISIS or Ebola or some I think would be sort of terrorism and more kind of concrete things that Americans see as potentially affecting us here in the homeland. That being said, the other thing is that mostly presidents can ignore Congress or don't have to deal with Congress as much on foreign policy. Here is a different set of issues that you mentioned, and I think the trick for the president is that he does have some members of his own party. You mentioned Chairman Menendez and others who might be more strongly for some of these sanctions than his administration is. So I still think ultimately if the president does not want it, he's got the we haven't seen an override of a veto in a very long time, and it's hard to imagine in a polarized world that you would get to that point. He'd keep his party with him. So I think things may change in terms of the atmosphere a bit. You might have more Republicans criticizing the president or pushing for stronger measures. But as you noted, there was already kind of faction within the Democratic Party in the Senate who was going in that direction. So I think at the end of the day, the ball is in the president's court. If he really does not want to go in that direction, he does not have to. He may face some more public pressure, but it's in some ways it may be not as hard, the pressure coming from the Republican side, than sort of more obviously from some of his own Democratic colleagues.
Great. We'll come here to the front.
Thank you. My name is Stefan Grob with Euronews. We're based in France. I don't know whether you've been there.
I have been there, but I was not there this summer, so
okay.
My streak has ended. So
I want to talk about the unpopularity of the president, and we've talked about the good economic numbers, but still, he's unpopular. He has become unpopular, especially in the South. And if we look at the Senate races, we never talk about the northern races where Democrats will be re-elected. We only talk about the battleground races, and with the possible exception of New Hampshire, the Democrats will win their races in the North. But in the South, he's particularly unpopular in states like Arkansas, Louisiana, etc. And I want to know to what extent is race an issue here. This just flared up recently last week with some remarks by Senator Landrieu. How much does race contribute to the unpopularity of President Obama?
Well, I think it's a complicated answer to that question. On the one hand, I think much of the South, of course, is quite conservative and Republican, and is broadly opposed to what they see as northern or Midwestern liberal Democrats. So if you look at many places in the South, the same people who were very opposed to Barack Obama were very opposed to John Kerry running for president. So I think that is true. One thing that I think is different with the president, where he ran both in 2008 and 2012 with a different coalition, not dramatically different coalition. African Americans were, of course, always in the Democratic camp. But when Bill Clinton won some states in the South, he's from Arkansas, obviously, won his home state, as well as several others in both elections, he won with a different coalition, the old coalition, which was moderate Southern whites and African Americans, but not so much what the Barack Obama coalition is a stronger turnout from African Americans. Therefore, states like Arkansas, which don't have quite as large a population, are not as easily won. And the kind of newer economy type who like Barack Obama. So when you look at Northern Virginia, we're near where we are today, you certainly have that mix. You have strong kind of almost northeastern type of educated younger workforce that is amenable to voting for Barack Obama. Plus, you have a state that's 20% African American, and a lot of and that coalition works. It's what makes North Carolina close and competitive, and what Democrats are hoping makes Georgia, which is actually a state with the third highest percentage of African Americans, potentially competitive. I don't think actually Democrats are going to win there this time, but it's close. Is it an important issue? Well, it is an important issue. I don't want to cast aspersions and say that race is the driving factor in the terms of people just really disliking the president because of race. I think there's a strong difference between the parties. But will the president be able to rally his base of African Americans? They're still broadly supportive of him in the polls. But will they turn out as much? Probably not as much in midterm elections. And so he's lost, in a way, some of the enthusiasm in some of the places from his base. And look, Republicans who are primarily in the white in the Republican Party in the South are more energized. So I don't think it's necessarily a straight-out racism that they don't like the president. But I do think some of the factors have changed. The president in power loses that support of his real strong base. And the out party has a little bit more enthusiasm. They don't like him. They think he's, they see him as weak. They think things are not going as well. They're more likely to turn out.
Okay, I'm going to go there to this young woman in the back.
Hi, thank you. My name is Raquel Godos. I work for the Spanish Newswire, EFE. You've been talking about how Republicans during these years and also Democrats have been getting apart. But I'm wondering if now that Republicans are watching the presidential elections on 2016, they could be or they could get softer in their positions in the Congress. There are some issues that maybe Obama could get done with a Republican Congress regarding that they have to think about 2016, like, for instance, immigration reform. Thank you.
Sure. I think your point about the longer-term demographics of the parties is important here. I guess I mean, certainly all of you know this. It's out in the news, and I think it's broadly true that the Democratic Party has better prospects for the long term with their current coalition, that the growing groups of Hispanic voters being a larger part of the electorate, younger voters being strongly Democratic, and Republicans relying, especially on older voters, is probably good for Democrats in the longer term. And we've seen what I think Democrats think is good developments for them slowly over time. One thing I would emphasize is I think the changes are slow and incremental, and it's better for Democrats over time, but the swings of the pendulum, the swings back and forth, are larger than that. So you can see Republicans do quite well in this election. And I am not one who believes that the presidential elections are, some people will say presidential elections are just so, the mix of voters is so Democratic that Republicans could never win. I don't believe that. But I do think Republicans have some issues and some work to be done. One of the ways in which it was talked about that Republicans might help heal that divide would be to pass immigration reform. There was a lot of work on this. Obviously, we got far in the Senate and we got up to a certain point, and then it did not happen. I frankly think probably we're going to be awfully polarized on immigration after this election, partly because we didn't get an agreement, partly because the president's going to act in some way on his own in some direction. Republicans aren't going to like that. So I think in the back of Republicans' minds are, yes, they want to find a way to appeal to Hispanic voters. Some of that may come from running candidates. I think actually there are probably going to be two Hispanic presidential candidates on the Republican side, Ted Cruz and Marco Rubio. But I think it's just harder for the party, which has some splits. It has splits that are pro-business and a little more pro-immigration, and others that are worried about it. And it's not easily resolved with the Democrats. And I think the timing is always hard on these things, that someday this may happen, but it's hard to see, at least initially, that there's a great opening for immigration reform. So.
A question up here in the front. Don't go.
Hi, thank you. My name is Jeremy from the Straits Times of Singapore. The question I had was part of the reason for President Obama's low ratings on foreign policy is that there has been this pervasive narrative of weakness. And I was wondering if the Republicans, as predicted, do make great gains tonight. How will this affect his narrative of weakness and, in turn, the way he conducts his foreign policy for the remaining 2 years?
Well, it's a good question. I think you're right. I think I think before ISIS became a factor in Ebola, which I think were a little more concrete, which some Republicans ran ads on, the larger theme was, look, things aren't going very well, the president isn't managing things, and that it was sort of a more malaise weakness than just focusing on one issue. Look, at the end of the day, I think it's probably not going to affect that much. The president has 2 years left. He's going to have certain foreign policy tools and policies that he wants to put in place, many of them which don't require what Congress says. He may get more criticism, but Congress really doesn't have the ability to stop him from going in a certain direction. So I guess I think it's maybe hard to turn public opinion around, but that sometimes depends on events. And I don't think that he's going to be more constrained by the change of the Republican Congress, or this view that he may be weak doesn't really constrain a president who's got 2 years left, who could say, look, I'd like to do things more for the future or my legacy, or just because it's in front of me. He's not running for election. He doesn't have as many constraints on him. So I think it's probably not likely to have great effect on him.
I still have a question here, and then we'll go over to the right here. Barbara.
Hi, my name is Niklas Richter, Süddeutsche Zeitung, Germany. Thank you for doing the briefing. I have another question on 2016 and the Republicans. Now, I've heard many times, people say they need really a rebranding. They need to have a softer, more positive message. They need to unite first and overcome their internal divisions. How big is this challenge, in your opinion? And who would be a good candidate for this party to really reach a majority of Americans again? Thank you.
I'll go back to my trip. I did visit your country this summer. See, I'm covering a lot. So I was on a cruise. That made it easier. I did go to some different places. This came up earlier, the question of Republicans and rebranding, especially for a presidential election, because the presidential election turnout, we're going to see 40 to 45% turnout here in the midterm, closer to 60% in a presidential election, at least the last three times. And of course, not everybody who doesn't vote is a Democrat, but the mix is better. There's a more diverse electorate in 2016 than there will be tonight or today. Look, I think it is a challenge for Republicans. I don't think that it's sort of easy for the party to sort of just or any party to really change their stripes. On the one thing is that the Republicans will have a different look to their election. I mean, the Democrats will have a clear favorite in Hillary Clinton, and I know I got up here probably in front of this very same audience here in 2006 and said, well, of course, the leading favorite to be the nominee in 2008 would be Hillary Clinton, and who could beat her? And that didn't happen. So I'm put myself out there again. But it is there's a leading candidate, and the Republican side, it's a large field. I don't think it's a bad field, but it will be a multi-candidate race. And one of the difficulties is you don't know if two conservatives are going to split the conservative vote and a more establishment person is going to get in. I think Republicans have had some worries that, at least in congressional races, that they have sometimes elected people who are not electable, elected people in the primaries who are not electable. That hasn't happened so much in this election. This election, I think they have a lot of strong candidates. They're not liberals, they're conservative candidates, so I don't think the Republican Party is going to move away from being a conservative party. Of course, it would be a very interesting dynamic if the Republicans put a Hispanic on the ticket. And I think maybe some people would think, well, we didn't mean Ted Cruz. I'm not going to say that, but Marco Rubio, Ted Cruz are both Hispanic members of Congress and members of the Senate who might run. That would be an interesting point, and certainly their Republicans will show some diversity in these elections with the re-election of two Hispanic governors in Nevada and New Mexico, very, very, very likely. So look, I think it's a little too early to say who would be the best candidate, but I do think it is important for Republicans to have a candidate who has, a positive vision, who can straddle. There will be a conservative nominee who believes in smaller government and believes in broad things that Republicans believe in, but probably someone who has a somewhat more positive message and has some reach out to a broader community. And I think there will be a mix of candidates in the race, some of whom will be more clearly oppositional and maybe not have that, but others who will be able to reach across the party. Look, at the end of the day, too, I think we don't know what the conditions are going to be like in 2016. Hillary Clinton, if she's the nominee, will be a bit of her own person, but anyone is tied to their president in some ways. And so John McCain was tied to George Bush a bit. If Barack Obama is doing a lot better in 2016, that'll be a great send-off for the Democratic nominee for Hillary Clinton. If things get worse for the president, then it's a real opening for Republicans. So I think radical change is probably unlikely in any party, but a nominee who reaches out to at least the broad parts of their party, and to the diversity of America, I think would be a good thing for Republicans.
We'll go to the question over here.
Hello. Yes, good to see you.
Yeah, I know you came to Tokyo so many times.
Yes. I actually haven't been, but maybe you can work that out for me. So,
quick question. I understand the polarization is a problem of current U.S. politics, and I'm wondering if anything might be changed by this election. So the situation might be better or worse. What's your take on that?
Well, in one way, I think it probably will be a little worse, and I hate to say that. I, for years, have written election columns, and I remember every 2 years sort of writing, well, it's amazing, we were actually even more polarized than we were before, partly because these kind of moderate, conservative Democrats, liberal Republicans kept disappearing in these elections. And at least in the Senate, I think you are going to see in these 6 seats, I think all of them, but at least most of them, will be in Republican hands and no longer in conservative Democrat hands. There won't be a lot of kind of middle people left over. On the other hand, I do think, and we mentioned on the Republican side, some of the candidates that they're running are electable. They're able to win general elections. They're broader-based candidates. So I don't think that we're going to wake up and see that the parties agree on everything. I think the hope is that we do some things to make our institutions work better, to make the House and Senate work better, to find some common ground between these two parties that are far apart. But I don't think that I don't think this election is going to be great for it. It's probably the very end, the last bits of a trend. I used to tell a story that back in 1992, if you looked at the House of Representatives, you would have found 90 or so Democrats who were in really Republican districts, districts that Ronald Reagan or other Republicans had won. And that number today is about 5, and probably 2 or 3 after this election. So really, there aren't as many people who are right in the middle, who are going home to people of the other party. So that I think is worrisome. But it's been the end of a long trend, and I think it's probably not a huge difference from this Congress, but probably a little bit more. The middle, at least in the Senate, will disappear after this election.
We have time for one more question, if there is one.
Yes, this is Thomas Gorgisian from At-Tahrir, Egypt. My question is related because you are talking about the trends and from 2008 and 2012 and so on. There are 2 factors people usually are talking about it, and it seems that it's changing. From your perspective, can you analyze me first the factor of women, and the other, the factor or the composite of the dynamics, the millennials?
Sure. Well, look, we sometimes talk about the gender gap in America, and women have been voting more for the Democratic Party than the Republican Party for a while. Long ago it was the other way, but that's none of us really remember that. But and we'll see that again in this election. I do think it's you have seen some cases where the parties, I think partly because they are more apart and some states are more one way or the other, where they feel a little more comfortable running on issues. The President and Democrats in some places have run on the issue of the war on women. That's certainly been a big issue in Colorado. Some people think it's been too much of one issue, and the Republican certainly has a chance of winning there. But look, I think women vote at a little higher rate than men. There are more women. They vote at a little higher rate than men, and they're more Democratic. So that's a beneficial thing for Democrats. I don't think we've seen a dramatic move of women in the Democratic direction over the last 4 years, but still it's a important group that that favors Democrats and turns out. The millennial generation is younger voters are really more clearly Democratic. If you look at the president's ratings, older voters are, of course, the most negative on him, and younger voters are the only ones who give him a positive rating, who actually think he's doing a better job than not. And on a number of issues are more socially liberal, are more diverse, are more certainly more Hispanic and more African American. Now, look, I think there's been some speculation. It's absolutely true that younger voters vote less than anyone else. And the president did get younger voters excited in 2008, get their highest rate of turnout ever, and it was still lower than all the other groups, right? It was still lower than the 30-somethings and the 40-somethings. And in midterm elections, there does tend to be a fall off more among younger voters. So I guess I expect we'll see that. But it is it is an issue for Republicans. If for now there's a group of 10 years or so of people who are pretty strongly against them, and maybe it'll change a little bit in this election, but I don't expect it to change dramatically. If the next generation, the next people who are in high school and continue to be more Democratic, I think that's going to be very hard for Republicans to deal with. So we'll see what that new. If any of you are polling 6-year-olds or 12-year-olds, you should let me know what they're saying, because we'd be interested in knowing that. But right now, of course, that is the most Democratic group, and one that might help the president or help Democrats pull out some of these close races.